Hello again, Conference Report. So here's the second video in response to the video that you sent me. Uh, it it took me a couple days to think through this, but you touched on a few things in there that began to coalesce in my mind, and I wanted to sort of pull some threads together, right? So you talk about first of all, different kinds of power, and you talk about entertainment power, um, and I would link that to your point about the fact that the mechanisms on YouTube, likes and dislikes and stuff like that, the mechanisms on YouTube and such are really designed for marketing purposes, right? So this notion of entertainment power, or I would link this to Guy Debord's notion of the society of the spectacle, right? So this is a form of power where, and he was thinking of this probably in relation to the television, but the notion that everybody is watching and therefore not participating in, right? So this notion of being a spectator as a method of control, right? And you also touch on the fact that our historical records, basically the videos and tweets and blogs and stuff, all this stuff that we put on the internet doesn't go away. And I would say that, and I would link this to another idea. I'd link this to the idea of the panopticon, right? To go back to Foucault again. So the notion of being watched, right? And there's something, and this is the underside of what that digital microphysics of power is designed to do, which you don't touch on, but I think is important. On the one hand, like, yes, all of that is designed for attracting advertising revenues, but on the other hand, it's also designed for the collection of data about users, right? That might come across as a bit paranoid, but it just happens to be the case that one of the things that Google is really in the business of doing is collecting as much information about us as possible. That's something that I don't think can be denied, and that has huge political implications that are disturbing and unsettling. But so there's this coupling of the panopticon with the society of the spectacle, right? To watch and to be watched, and this used to be true in a different way, right? This maybe 20 years ago, this was true in that we would watch television, which is a sort of one-way medium, and we were watched by like security cameras in banks and whatever kind of institutions you like. And so these two things were sort of divided. But one thing that the internet has done is kind of hammered these two things together, right? So on Facebook, for instance, I watch at least a certain image of my friends. So I am part of the panopticon that's watching, right? That they have to maintain appearances for. And at the same time, in that watching of my friends, there's an element of coercion as well, because as a spectator, right? So there's this like really strange feedback loop between these two ideas that occurs in the age of the internet. And to tell you the truth, I have no idea what the effects of that are. But I think that interesting things have come out of it, because it's this feedback loop is extremely hungry in a certain way. I'm going to use a lot of poetic language sort of here, because I don't know how else to articulate, particularly going forward with the notes that I have, I don't necessarily know how to articulate it in any other way. It's sort of hungry in that it's not enough for us to be subject to that, but as you rightly mentioned, like presidential candidates also fall victim to this, particularly with like camera phones and the ability to watch and then post and do all of this. So like Mitt Romney giving his 47% statement, right? Or Anthony Bologna, the police officer who pepper sprayed the Occupy protesters and such. There's this it's not sufficient for this sort of self-sustaining feedback loop of power relations to only consume one class, if you like. There's something out of control about it, which I think is really interesting. There's introduced a kind of eccentric unpredictability with social media, and I don't know where that goes or what happens. It's just something that I'm observing. And then you also talk more than once about sort of the historical formation of power. This is another really, really, really strange feature of the internet. Internet in that the points that you make about how, first of all, how the universities sort of formed over time, and also how the monarchy in the UK sort of formed over time. These are, you're right about those points, but there's something with the internet where like history collapses into an ideological background screen. This is a really, really esoteric point, but the fact that I can watch a YouTube video of myself from a year and a half ago, and in this very, very real sense, actually, do what there's a Zen Buddhist saying, right? To make pastime present, right? The fact that I can do this, right? There's a strange our subjective relationship to time changes with the internet, which is a really bizarre notion. There's just like a collapse of time, which I think this will be something, again, like kids being born and growing up in a world where YouTube already exists and having at their fingertips, at least from, let's say, 1950 on, all this video material just at their disposal at any time that they can pull up, just constantly being able to make pastime present, right? Or texts even about other times before that. This sort of creating, I think we've always thought through history in the sense that we create a model of history in the present and then talk about that, right? So there's always this dimension of pulling history into the present so that we can speak about it, or so that we can learn about it, or something like that. That has always been the case, but I think the internet really, really collapses things, and I think going forward this is going to become even more strange. This is kind of a Baudrillard point, and what I'd say is that what we're left with is a kind of hyper history, right? And I mentioned Baudrillard. Baudrillard has this notion of the hyper real. So something that is more real than real, something that there's that line in A Clockwork Orange where he says, "It's funny how blood doesn't seem really real until you view it on a movie screen." That's the hyper real, right? Like it's a movie that makes it more real than the real thing, right? So this hyper, Baudrillard talks about hyper reality. I talk here about a kind of hyper history, where the model of history that we build and aggregate on the internet ends up becoming more present than the notion of something that's backwards in time. I don't know if I can articulate that very well, but there is a kind of temporal collapse, subjectively speaking. The other thing, too, is that there's a collapse of space, right? So I can log on and talk to, when we do Google Hangouts, there was one, To Be Serious was on one, and, she's in England, I'm in New Orleans, Theo's on the East Coast, Mike Norman's on the West Coast, and so we have all these different people, and yet we're all here, right? So there's this strange collapse of space, and there's a strange rearticulation of the limits that come along with distance, right? Like that's important to think through as well. So there's this collapsing of space and time, or should I say maybe a transfiguring of what space and time mean to us. And that's genuinely fascinating, especially because across different spaces, you're taking people who live in communities, who live in a spatial sort of environment that has its own set of norms and its own sort of rules for how to conduct oneself and how to engage with other people and all of this. And you're taking these different spaces that have different normative realities. Think about China and how different it is to the rules of being social are very different in China. And so if you were to take as a Google Hangout as an example, if you put somebody who was born and raised and has always lived in China with somebody who's born and raised and always lived in America, those aren't just two people, there are two sets of norms that are colliding in that environment. And this kind of thing has always happened throughout history, but the internet like smashes these things together in an incredible way. And so there's this is thinking about my trolling video, talking about a cut at the transcendental level of discourse. There's also a smashing together of various different things that happens. The sort of tectonic plates of discourse collide and shake. And what I want to say here is that what all of this means, what I'm getting to with all of this, is that perhaps the best way to think through the cultural impact of the internet is actually as a trauma, right? Like these various realities might well at the cultural level be traumatic to us, and like all traumas, we can't express and articulate these things directly. We have to talk about them indirectly. So this might be why we have conversations about the internet where we bring to bear these metaphors, like these real world metaphors, because we can't there's been a break, and so we can't articulate what's happening. We can't enunciate what's happening. So we have to kind of dance around it, and we have to this is really hard. This might be why it's so hard for me to talk about the internet and what the internet does to our culture, because it's and why these videos are so long. Actually, it's because we can't do it. We have to employ these sort of defense mechanisms, and this might be why there are so many conversations about. We don't really tend to talk about the internet as a whole. We talk about what specific companies do. This might be why. It's a way of keeping the whole of the internet at bay, because it's so traumatic. Or someone like uh, Ray Kurzweil talking about, he's created a story around the internet, and this leads to the idea of the synchronicity, and we'll all be happy virtual entities or something like this, which I'm very skeptical about, obviously. But this narrating of what happened is another way of it's another kind of defense mechanism for coping with the internet. Another way would be to totally think about it, to try and make it neutral, to neutralize it. So like Noam Chomsky talks about the internet in terms of being it's just a neutral thing. It all depends on who has it, and this and that, which I'm very skeptical about it. I think that there are implicit social forms to do with that. And also, I think that this is why it's possibly so difficult to actually legislate for, or to come up with laws surrounding the internet, because we're not at a point where we can articulate the effects of this trauma, right? And this also has to do with the fracturing of space and time, because if you talk to a trauma victim, the recollections of a trauma are not coherent. The authentic recollections, right? After the fact, after a certain amount of time, they can put things together into kind of a sequential order and a kind of sequential story. But we know that this is them narrating what happened to keep the traumatic reality at bay, right? But in the moment of a trauma, or immediately after, everything is confused, right? The spatiotemporal perception of their experience is all jumbled, and everything's all, and they can't talk, they can't just fucking speak and articulate themselves, and maybe as kind of a metaphor, this might be the most effective lens through which to think of the cultural effects of the internet. That might be really esoteric, and some people might say that's meaningless, but I think but for me, I've been thinking about this for the past couple days, and it's kind of fascinating me more and more and more as I think about it. So that's my second video. It's very long again, and I'm sorry for giving you two very long videos, but have a good day.